I'm here today with Sandra Navidi, the founder and chief executive of BeyondGlobal, an international consulting firm. We're here to talk about her book, Super-Hubs, How the Financial Elite and Their Networks Rule the World. Sandra, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Rob. Pleasure to be here.
This book interests me in so many different dimensions. As you know, the Institute for New Economic Thinking is involved in network theory and complex systems and so forth. But you actually added the texture of people onto this, how people become the magnets inside these networks and how they work effectively or not so effectively, how think tanks interact with them. So you've added a great deal of what you might call textured human understanding of what these networks are. This isn't just a cell phone grid. This involves people.
Well, yes, what I wanted to show is that finance is essentially a human system. It's not abstract institutions or abstract globalization or capital flows or quantitative models. It's people who make decisions, people who preside over these institutions. And there's an interesting study the Swiss Institute of Technology did to show that only a handful of financial institutions worldwide hold global corporate control of most corporations in the world, and that of course gives the people who are in charge of these corporations enormous power, and many of them are, very famous financial institutions like JP Morgan, Barclays, and so forth.
But there are also people within these groups, and you've talked about various people that the INET community is very familiar with. A lot of these people are practicing what you preach in many, many dimensions.
Yes, I wanted to explain how these people become super-hubs, and maybe just to explain, super-hubs are the nodes within networks that are the most connected, and by virtue of their connections, they move into the center of the network. We are all nodes within the network, and nodes in any network, that could be the ecology or our brain or an ant colony, all nodes prefer to attach to other nodes who already have many connections, because connections are a guarantee for survival, or make survival more likely. And so these people strive to be super hubs, and they maintain their super hub position with their connections, and the safest way to do that is to build networks. And that's, for instance, because you mentioned Steve Schwarzman with the network that he's building in China, and he's building overlapping networks, and we see that with many of these super hubs, that they're proactively actually building networks where they're in the middle and they preside over the information flow and all sorts of network currencies like money that flow over these pathways.
These what you might call connection between commerce and the demonstration of intellect and imagination is a very interesting, I would say, part of what constitutes a magnetic field for being at the center of a super hub.
Yes, connections are exceedingly important, because while individual superhubs have immense power, what makes them extremely or increases their power exponentially is their connections, because in any network, the nodes have limited ability to speak to what the network does or to the network's behavior. What's really what determines the network behavior is the connections between those individual nodes. And these people, the superhubs, increase their power through multi-layered, multidimensional networks. So it's most efficient if you connect a financial network with a political network and the corporate network. Then you've got basically all bases covered. And if you can throw in philanthropy and culture, you fortify this kind of structure.
Well, there's certain, how would I say, enthusiasm associated with your insight and admiration for people who've mastered these skills. You've also talked about ones that have broken down. Specific examples of people who've been at the hub of a network, and these are not what we might call cast in stone. They're human organisms that sometimes fail, and some people who fall out come back in. I'm curious how you see that dynamic process. Without necessarily picking on any individual, what happens when a network hub fails and is what you might call cast out of the flow?
Superhubs get expelled from the system because of their grave violations, and sometimes they're allowed back in. But I think someone like Dick Fulp, for instance, has not reemerged. Someone like Dominic Strauss-Kahn is trying to come back. And I say in the book, what really distinguishes superhubs, everybody in that sphere at the very top of the financial system is very smart and is very industrious and has gotten an elite education, But what makes the ultimate competitive advantage is their ability to build relationships.
So it's an emotional intelligence rather than an IQ which is the secret sauce in this instance.
Exactly, which is often underrated because it doesn't enjoy the same prestige as do hard skills like a measurable education. But when these people have basically violated the rules of the system and have violated the rules of relationships, that's why they get expelled, and not all of them manage to make a comeback.
All of this is a very interesting question. What makes, other than just what you might call plain old jealousy, what makes these systems vulnerable to collapse or to degeneration?
It's network dynamics. It's a law of nature. That's why I say it's not a conspiracy. All networks over time have the tendency to become more homogeneous and more interlinked. And that's why they become skewed after a while. A good example, for instance, is the ecology, where after a while when a system gets skewed, corrective mechanisms kick in, corrective feedback loops that rebalance the system. And what I argue in the book is that these super hubs try to optimize the system for themselves. Like everybody, every person acts in their own self-interest. It's actually, not unethical per se, but they act all in their own interest. They build ever more connections. The system gets skewed. They disable corrective mechanisms like, for instance, regulatory reform. And then after a while, the system becomes fragile. And I actually think Brexit or polarization and populism in Europe and the election here in the United States are a manifestation of that.
And you're touching on something very important here. When people manage these networks, and you talk about them as being multifaceted, political, cultural, artistic, financial, when they get so powerful, they start to have disproportionate influence on the public infrastructure. So you can see the people outside the network feeling like they were part of the society, but now, as Donald Trump said, the system is rigged, and they start to react against, the exercise of power within the network.
Yes, they're basically trying to rebalance the system, and it's also a result of network dynamics, homogeneity, homophily actually is called in network science, like and like attracts. So these people go to the same schools, they live in the same neighborhoods, they have the same interests. Not even intentionally and often subconsciously, they exclude others who are not like them. And there's one difference that is very hard to bridge, and that is socioeconomic difference. People who come from a different strata of society, who have a different accent, who have different experiences, have a harder time breaking into the system because there's this thing called airport test, where in job interviews, those who interview, who are the people in power at companies, subconsciously exclude people who are different, who may have also an equally as good education as somebody else from the same school, but they can't relate to that person so well. And so that's why the system becomes more homogeneous over time. That is also a reason why there are so few women and other minorities.
Now we're in this realm of EQ, not IQ. You can have a very high IQ, but if you're outside the circle of characteristics, people feel unsafe around you, and your abilities are not realized or not rewarded either through hiring or through compensation or through promotion. So it's a very interesting, aspect of this network phenomenon.
And it's self-perpetuating. A manifestation is also assortative mating. First of all, when a college education became more available, people in rural areas would be drawn more to the coastal areas or more prosperous areas. And so we saw basically a brain drain. And then what happened was assortative mating, that people from the same socioeconomic background would marry each other, and their offspring would, of course, be much better off, and they would be able to give their children access to better education and opportunities. So that's why the system is, again, becoming more homogeneous, more concentrated, more skewed.
Now, you talk about the safety of identifying people, forming a network, and being in the network. But in the aftermath of a rebellion against the network, like, say, the election of Donald Trump, where he's saying the system is rigged, I've seen a lot of backlash on the part of the elites, the people who have prestigious degrees, towards the population as a whole. I don't know how our society heals itself when the people who have the degrees, have been in the networks, have had all the benefits, experience, rather than empathy for the people who were in despair, engage them with ridicule. I had hoped like the election would teach us all a lesson. It would be like a lightning bolt, a wake-up call, that we would lose our false innocence and we would build a more humanly, how do you say, caring society. But we may have to go through more pain before we can get to that point.
I actually feel I have seen some empathy and some people being self-critical, but I do agree that we will probably see more pain because I think Donald Trump is even more polarizing. He's pitting people against each other, minorities against each other, and against the establishment, everybody against everybody, basically. And I think that is very toxic.
And we see within the Democratic Party a civil war going on. So it's not just Donald Trump and his surroundings. Everything's come a little bit loose. And this so-called super hub system is going through some convulsions right now.
But the danger is also when a system rearranges, and I give as an example the change from the Soviet Union to Russia, which gave rise to Putin and a handful of oligarchs who, again, were well connected in networks to government and who had access to capital. That led to even more polarization, and Putin's personal fortune is estimated to be over $200 billion. And you have the oligarchs, and I think the tendency with Trump is also that it's becoming more exclusive. We're seeing the nepotism. He's bringing his family in. He's bringing loyalists in. It's becoming even more homogeneous. It's just older white men. It's network science at an extreme because in a system like that, it's basically a closed system where relationships become all decisive. If you don't have a relationship to Trump of trust, you're not going to get in.
So in Greek mythology, they called this hubris. Things go until they become unsustainable, and then they collapse under their own weight.
Exactly.
And I want to go back, though. I mean, I find this book, like I said, fascinating because it has a human feel to it. It has a logical feel to it. When did you start building the hypothesis to create this book? When did you see, what was the time of like recognition that this was the process that was unfolding?
I think the first document I saved on this book was 2011. It was an evolution, and I originally had started writing about networks as a blueprint to how the world works, but it was too amorphous a subject. I always got sidetracked with interesting research, but couldn't pull together a book. And then I thought, why don't I just focus on the super hubs and CEOs? But that, again, was a very wide field, and I would always get sidetracked back to finance because that's my professional background. And so in the end, I thought, why don't I just write about what I know best, which is finance. And basically finance is the operating system of our world, of our society anyway. Everything we do is based on our financial system and our relationships.
But I know a lot of people like yourself that spent time on Wall Street working in the transaction flow and so forth that never had what you might call this kind of pattern recognition about how the meta system is organized.
Oh, thank you.
And I think that's quite extraordinary. And how you arrived at that insight, I think I'm very curious about.
Well, I started in structured finance when I was still working at Deloitte & Touche in Germany, so I saw how the sausage is made, even though I didn't have a wider understanding of the context. And then I got an offer from a client to work in the United States as in-house counsel, and when you at an investment firm, and when you work on transactions like CDOs, or you have to pull together a hedge fund or a private equity fund, you really have to understand the structure or else you can't draft the documents. And then I worked for a brief while in investment banking. And then I worked with Nuria Rubini, the economist, who's a macroeconomist.
So and wrote the foreword to your book, right?
Yes, he was kind enough.
That's great.
And so I feel I got, a 5,000 level view, a 10,000 level, always a little higher. But I also could relate to the base, to the individual transactions.
But how would I say? You kind of move from that abstract place of the finance and the financial flows to the human place of what is the glue that puts it all together, and what are the characteristics of those people. And I think that's a fascinating, I would say, second layer. And it's like contemporary history that you're writing.
Well, I had the privilege to interact with most of the super-hubs that I write about, and I felt that that's an aspect, the human aspect is often neglected. We focus so much on dogma and theories and quantitative models and leave out really what is at the base of it all. And when now we discuss, you know, our computer networks taking over robots, machines, that is all true, but we must not forget that it's people like a Peter Thiel or, you know, financiers who even make the decision what gets financed, where do they throw their money behind or their influence, which projects are they banned, and even governments can switch off the internet. We've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it even in the United States, in San Francisco and Boston. So in the end, it always comes back to people.